Good evening, everyone. It is my pleasure, my distinct pleasure, to be able to acknowledge and also welcome Sumona Majumdar, the General Counsel of Earth Island Institute, in a discussion today of Earth Island's efforts to promote transparency and accountability in corporate actions. She'll be highlighting the organization's legal filings against Coca-Cola and Blue Triton, the former Nestlé Waters North America. I'm very excited because this conversation is one that actually comes after another conversation that I've had the opportunity to have with her. And I think that you'll find it extremely enlightening and hopefully be part of the information arsenal that you will use, hopefully, to help people understand the magnitude of the plastics issue and the reason why we need to be vigilant. So thank you so much for joining us, Sumona, and please let me give it to you.
You're welcome, and thank you, Madhavi, for inviting me back to have this discussion, which I have titled today as, The Plastic Crisis and the Role of Corporate Deception. Before we get into it, I just want to say a little bit about who we are and what we do. As Madhavi said, I'm the General Counsel at Earth Island Institute. Earth Island was founded in 1982 by David Brower. It's based in Berkeley, and it provides support to environmental action projects and to the next generation of environmental leaders in order to achieve solutions to the crises threatening the survival of life on Earth. We act as a fiscal sponsor to approximately 75 projects, including a number that are working at the forefront of the plastic crisis, such as the Plastic Pollution Coalition and Rise St. James. Other projects work in the areas of conservation, energy and climate, women's environmental leadership, international and indigenous communities, sustainability, and much more. We also have a legal division, Earth Island Advocates, of which I'm the director, a youth leadership program, New Leaders Initiative, and an award-winning journal called Earth Island Journal. At 40 years old, we continue to be one of the leading environmental activist organizations in the United States. So not surprisingly, we're heavily involved on the plastic issue. I'll give a little bit of an overview about the impacts of the plastic crisis. I'm sure many of you are already well aware, but I don't want to assume. It seems like every single day we learn about some new horrific fact about plastic's omnipresence and its harm to human health, the environment, and wildlife. In short, we are producing, using, and discarding of way too much plastic, approximately 380 million tons annually, which is an increase of 200-fold since the 1950s. And about 40% of this plastic is for packaging. This is plastic which is going to be used just once and then thrown away. Plastic is also everywhere. It's now a common component of sand, and it's embedded in our seagrass. It's in the snowpack in the Alps. It's in the Marianas Trench. It's in our water supplies, and it's in our bodies, and it's ingested by all forms of wildlife. Not surprisingly, this fact, plastic is wreaking all kinds of havoc on us, from strangling marine mammals to starvation of organisms, endocrine disruption in our bodies, and much more. We're really only at the tip of the iceberg in terms of understanding the environmental and health impacts from all this plastic. Whoops, I'm sorry, I went ahead. It's not only an environmental issue, but it's also an environmental justice issue. Plastic is polluting our environment and bodies with a predominant impact on Black and Brown communities. It's a fossil fuel-based product, and so from extraction to production to use and disposal, it's all having an outside impact on these communities. One of our projects, Rise St. James, is at the epicenter of the petrochemical build-out to support plastic production, and they are very literally fighting for their lives in pushing back against the siting of more facilities in their community. So far, they have successfully organized their community to stop the proposed Formosa facility, which is a $9.4 billion facility that would span more than 1,200 football fields and legally emit 800 tons a year of toxic chemicals, nearly 6,500 tons of pollutants known to cause respiratory ailments, and more than 13.6 million tons of greenhouse gases annually. And all of this is within 1 mile of an elementary school. And this is all being done so that we can create more plastic for more packaging for more things. So now on to the misinformation campaign. So we know that this crisis is real. Plastic is pollution by design, and yet the costs of this design are being borne by us and not by the companies that are reaping immense profits from the production and use of plastics. And why is that? Well, in large part, it is because these corporations that are profiting have successfully engaged in a decades-long misinformation and reframing campaign that places the blame on individuals for the harms from plastic instead of on the companies creating and using plastic. Starting as early as the 1950s, when plastic became more common for consumer goods, companies such as Coke, Pepsi, Nestlé, and their related trade organizations recognized that consumers needed to believe that plastic is benign if they are going to accept vast quantities of it in their lives. And so these companies began to heavily promote the concept of individual responsibility and recycling as the keys to having large amounts of plastics in our lives without any negative externalities. Of course, we all now know that that's not true, but I want to talk a little bit about, what this campaign looked like. So starting in 1971, you had the Crying Indian. It was an Italian American hired to portray a Native American canoeing through a polluted river, and at the end saying, "People start pollution and people can stop it." In 1973, Exxon started working very hard to convince regulators to adopt the recycling symbol, even though they knew that there was no feasible way to recycle plastic on a large scale and likely never would be. In the 1980s, the industry started doubling down on their efforts to convince us that we could recycle our way out of plastic pollution. All the way to 2013, a more recent ad campaign called "I Want to Be Recycled," a lonely water bottles rolling through various landscapes and communities until someone picks it up and puts it in the recycling bin. Again, confirming this idea that it's on us to do our part to make sure that plastic ends up recycled. And if all of these tactics sound familiar to you, it's because they are. Countless corporations that put harmful and dangerous products out into the world have successfully used these exact same tactics to convince us that we individuals are the problem and not the products. So you have guns don't kill people, people kill people. You have the auto industry blaming pedestrians for their deaths and pushing for jaywalking laws, when instead it's the fault of cars that don't have proper safety mechanisms. But you know what? I think we're all starting to catch on to this ruse. And just today, the California Attorney General announced a broad investigation into the role of ExxonMobil in creating the myth of plastics being recyclable in order to push plastic production. And we're seeing the same thing happening with investigations into the fossil fuel industry, and you saw previous investigations into tobacco for their role in creating the harms from smoking. Now, as the plastic crisis is increasingly coming to the forefront and in the news, you are also seeing companies now starting to tout false solutions in their continued efforts to convince consumers of their commitments to sustainability. Last September, Pepsi announced what seems to be a very bold plan called Pep Plus to cut virgin plastic per serving by 50% across its global food and beverage portfolio, and to use 50% recycled content in its plastic packaging. This comes after an earlier launch by Coca-Cola of its World Without Waste campaign and a commitment of 100% recycled content, of starting to use a 100% recycled content bottle for certain brands and markets in the US. But the reality is that Pepsi uses 2.3 million tons of plastic annually, and this is not the first time they have made these kinds of pledges. Pepsi set a goal in 2010 of increasing the beverage container recycling rate in the US to 50%. By 2017, Pepsi recognized that it wouldn't come anywhere close to reaching this goal and just quietly abandoned this effort. More recently, Pepsi announced that it would reduce its use of virgin plastic by 35% by 2025. And yet, after only 1 year, it's achieved a 1% reduction. They still have a couple years left, but I wouldn't hold my breath. You also have false solutions. You also have companies touting false solutions in the plastic to fuel or waste to energy arena. So there's this idea that our plastic waste can now become a source of energy, but really this is nothing more than incineration, and essentially it's a toxic transfer of what's inside of a plastic bottle to the air, to water, soil, and into our bodies. As you can see from this graph, companies keep making these kinds of promises, and these promises keep garnering positive media attention. But in reality, they're just empty promises that have no teeth. And as one of the members of the Plastic Pollution Coalition said, all that's really being recycled are the promises. And then what's actually happening behind the scenes? Well, behind the scenes, these same companies are actively thwarting efforts that would result in improved recycling rates and reductions in plastic use. So you have these companies fighting bottle bills, which are demonstrated to significantly improve recycling rates, and yet industry continues to push back and defeat them in community after community. You have them fighting extended producer responsibility here in California and in other states that are exploring this option. There's already big fights gearing up. You also have support for things that will undermine municipalities' ability to regulate plastic. So you have industry associations and various companies urging states to adopt municipal preemption bills so that a city can't ban plastic bags and can't ban single-use plastic. And you also have support of litter bug fines and jail time for people who throw trash. Again, it's to reinforce this idea that it's the problem of the individual, and that if individuals just did their part, then we wouldn't have a problem, and it's to deflect the blame from corporations. Many of us in the NGO world have been making various efforts to hold corporations accountable as a result of their actions to undermine plastic legislation, and as a result of the greenwashing that we've been experiencing. So over the past 5 to 10 years, we've seen a variety of corporate accountability strategies really take off. The foundation for these efforts, in my opinion, is the excellent work that's been done by groups to quantify the role that various companies play in the plastic crisis. So for example, the Break Free from Plastic Coalition has done annual coordinated beach cleanups to identify the brands of products that are polluting our beaches and waterways. And for the past 3 years, the top 3 companies have been Coke, Pepsi, and Nestlé. Other excellent reports include the Talking Trash report, which identifies various plastic reduction commitments made by these companies and tracks their voluntary pledges. And as I said earlier, spoiler alert, these pledges have not been met. You're also seeing shareholder action. So we're seeing groups like As You Sow get shareholders to organize and have companies adopt various proposals that require commitments to reducing plastic waste. And you're seeing public pressure and direct action gaining traction on social media. And finally, you're seeing litigation become an increasingly important tool in holding corporations accountable. So we at Earth Island have filed a couple lawsuits using consumer protection laws to force corporations, hopefully we'll be able to force corporations to be more honest in their marketing. I'll start with our Blue Triton lawsuit since that one has gone now the furthest. It was filed in August of last year in DC Superior Court. We alleged violations under the DC Consumer Protection and Procedures Act. Specifically, we allege that Blue Triton, which used to be Nestlé Waters North America and owns about a third of the U.S. bottled water market, including Poland Spring, Pure Life, Splash, Arrowhead, and also contributes hundreds of millions of pounds of plastic to U.S. landfills. Our allegation is that their statements around sustainability and environmental stewardship are deceptive marketing, considering their contributions to the plastic pollution crisis. And when we called them out in our complaint, Blue Triton responded by filing a motion to dismiss. And in their motion to dismiss, Blue Triton argued that we didn't have an actionable claim because, in fact, their statements about sustainability and stewardship are actually non-actionable puffery. So their statements are hyperbolic, and in Blue Triton's words, that a reasonable consumer shouldn't see them as truths upon which they will act. So just to give you a flavor of some of what we pointed out to Blue Triton, you can see here that they switched to a new, I'm sorry, it probably looks a little bit small, but they adopted a new logo, and it's a Triton, and it's to reflect their role as a guardian of sustainable resources. Now, as I said earlier, Blue Triton used to be Nestlé Waters North America, and I query whether a company that uses this much plastic and has previously broken commitments can actually go forth and broken commitments around around reduction of plastic can actually go forth and now claim that they are a guardian of sustainable resources. Further on, they say that they use, as part of their commitment to the environment, they use #1 PET plastic, which can be recycled over and over and over again. This is absolutely false. At best, PET can be downcycled. So what happens is the plastic gets shredded up and it gets turned into something else that is of less value. So you'll see like maybe like a park bench or playground equipment. But once that piece of equipment's life is through, it's done. It's not going to be recycled again and turned into a water bottle. Another statement, they talk about that they're keeping bottles out of landfills and creating a circular economy, and they're committed to a better bottle. Again, I don't know how you can make these statements when your bottles are still being made of plastic. And we know that the plastic, that recycling capability and capacity simply cannot address all of the plastic that we have. I think many of you have heard the statistic of at best 9% of the plastic that has ever been made since the 1950s has been recycled, and we expect that that number is now going to be going down. Oh, one more image from Blue Triton. Again, talking about how their plastic products actually help lessen environmental harm, which is really an amazing claim to make. Moving on to Coca-Cola, who isn't really much better. We sued them in last June on the same grounds, false and deceptive advertising, also in DC under the DC Consumer Protection and Procedures Act. That case took a little bit longer to get through the preliminary issue of whether it would stay in state court or be in federal court. We now finally have a decision. It will stay in state court, and we expect that Coca-Cola will file a similar motion to dismiss in mid-June. Again, our arguments are that a company that uses 2.9 million metric tons of plastic every year simply cannot market itself as sustainable and environmentally friendly. We know that the vast majority of the plastic that Coca-Cola uses will become waste, whether in a landfill, incinerator, or in the environment. And as much as Coca-Cola wants to talk about recycling as the solution, we know it's a limited technology that can only capture an incredibly small percentage and will only result in the downcycling of the plastic. Again, I'll show you a couple of the claims that we highlight in our complaint. So here we have Coca-Cola's World Without Waste. And they talk about how they're going to collect for every bottle that they sell, they will collect and recycle a bottle. Again, there's simply no way that they could ever do this. They use 200,000 bottles a minute. There is nowhere in the world that can manage that kind of recycling. Again, touting their plan to get every single bottle back. And if you'll notice, all of these claims, both Blue Triton and Coca-Cola, they make these claims in a way that sound as if it is something that can definitely be done. There's no qualifying language. There's no sort of hedging their bets. They just make these claims, and then, as we've seen repeatedly in the past, when they don't live up to these claims, they just quietly retire them. Back in 1990, Coca-Cola made a commitment to produce bottles in the US with 25% recycled content. Within about a year or so after, they then revised that goal downward to just 10%. And then when they still failed to meet that goalpost, they just sort of moved on, and ultimately in 2006 they were using only 3.6% recycled content in their products in the US market. And again, Coca-Cola showing off their commitment to working with all of us to make sure that we're reducing plastic waste by getting it in the proper container and recycling it. And this is Coca-Cola seems to be recommitting themselves to this recycled content promise that they had made decades ago, and also making a commitment to 100% of their packaging being recyclable. Again, we know that putting the chasing arrows on something doesn't mean that it's actually going to be recycled. Maybe in theory there is a facility that can recycle that plastic bottle, but when you're talking about 2.9 million metric tons, there aren't enough facilities in the world to make sure that those plastic bottles are getting recycled. So our argument is that those aren't actually recyclable. There are other lawsuits out there as well that are in this consumer protection space and dealing with corporate accountability when it comes to their marketing claims. We filed a lawsuit here in California back in February 2020 against 10 major food, beverage, and consumer good companies, alleging that they spread misinformation about the recyclability of plastic packaging. And we also took it a step further and alleged that these companies are responsible for their contribution to the costs that California and individuals and groups bear in cleaning up plastic from waterways and coasts here in California. That lawsuit is still at the early stages. The out-of-state companies, including Coke, Pepsi, Nestlé, are all saying that we can't sue them here in California, that there's no personal jurisdiction. In 2018, a woman filed a lawsuit against Keurig Green Mountain, alleging that the company misrepresents the recyclability of their single-serve coffee pods. The that ended up as a certified class action, and then the suit subsequently settled for 10 million, plus an order that Keurig can no longer make unqualified recyclability claims for its K-cups. There was also a similar settlement in Canada following complaints about the inability to recycle the pods that went to Canada's Competition Bureau. And similarly, Keurig settled for some 2 or 3 million plus a similar, similar order that they can't continue making these claims. Another organization, the Last Beach Cleanup, sued TerraCycle and a number of companies that use TerraCycle in their efforts to promote their sustainability. TerraCycle is a company that supposedly takes various goods and then recycles them, and other companies then contract with TerraCycle to send their used products to TerraCycle. That lawsuit alleged that the defendants were misleading consumers by offering plastic recycling through TerraCycle while failing to acknowledge that the strict numerical limits prevent most consumers from actually using the program, and that they failed to substantiate that the products are actually recycled. This suit also settled just this past fall with an agreement that TerraCycle will pay legal fees and that the parties will change the product labels, and that TerraCycle will implement a supply chain certification program. The Sierra Club also sued Coca-Cola and Blue Triton. This lawsuit alleges that defendants are misleading consumers by claiming that their plastic bottles are 100% recyclable. This was also filed at the same time as a class action alleging the same claims. The cases were consolidated recently, and the companies filed a motion to dismiss, arguing, among other things, that Sierra Club was advocating for a implausible definition of recyclable because no consumer should believe that recyclable means that the product will actually be recycled, only that it can be recycled. Now, let's remember, Coca-Cola's whole World Without Waste campaign hinges on the concept that their bottle will be recycled. So they're sort of speaking out of both sides of their mouth here, which, supports our argument that this is a coordinated misinformation campaign. A couple screenshots from our filings, and lastly, a slide with some resources that might be interesting for all of you. As I said earlier, the California AG just announced this investigation. I highly recommend listening to Attorney General Bonta's announcement. It's very thorough about the decades-long campaign, and they've also put up a website that has additional information plus additional resources. There are a couple really interesting films that are available. The Story of Plastic, which is associated with the campaign The Story of Stuff. Breathe This Air, which is about the environmental justice impacts of plastic production and features Rise St. James. And also Plastic Wars by PBS Frontline, and done in conjunction with NPR, and which actually the Attorney General Bonta referenced as a critical piece of information in their decision to investigate Exxon. And I mentioned this report, the Talking Trash Report, and I also recommend checking out the Plastic Waste Makers Index by the Minderoo Foundation. Oh, so I'm sorry. I have like two screens going, so I didn't get to show you the resources. There they are, but and hopefully when this is available, we can make the slide available separately. All right. I think we're open up to questions now.
Thank you very much. It was very, very informative, and especially on the legal side, I think many people are not necessarily that knowledgeable about the different types of lawsuits that have been filed. And as you pointed out very clearly, the concept of recyclable has become synonymous with the concept of recycled. So with that, if I could please ask, if you have a question, to please put it in the chat, and we will take them as they come up. I will start with the very first question, in the sense that how much of the general public do you think is really aware of all of these issues? And even though you're bringing them up on the part of the consumer in general, as you can see, in terms of just general interest and understanding, seems to be grossly unaware, in spite of the fact that there are so many things happening outside the United States.
Yeah, I mean, there is a lot going on, and every single day we're being confronted with new environmental crises, right? So it's, I think that while the information is out there, it's hard for consumers to know exactly the pervasiveness of this issue of not only the fact that things aren't getting recycled, but there really isn't an ability to recycle this vast amount of plastic. And when you talk about the best the best case scenario in terms of capacity here in the United States is that maybe you capture 25% of the highest quality plastic, so your milk bottles and some of the other bottles. But that's a best case scenario. And if we're increasing plastic production, potentially by double, if all the production that's in the pipeline ends up actually happening, well, that there's just no way to handle it.
Well, you used a graphic from Beyond Plastics, and we know that Beyond Plastics recently had a press release that they put out stating that by 2030 they anticipate that the plastics industry will exceed the footprint of the coal industry, which right now in the United States is about 20% of greenhouse gas emissions. And with that being noted, just a simple question here is that people are so fixed on looking at the energy sector. What do you think that we're dealing on the other side here that may be actually negating everything that we're working on the energy side? And does it make sense that we should be focusing on maybe everything related to the petroleum industry?
Well, yeah, we need to look at where petroleum's making their money. And as, sorry, I just need a little water. As our buildings become more efficient, as our cars become more efficient, oil and gas is getting scared. They're like, where are we going to send our product to? And plastic is the answer. We and precisely because people are unaware of that link between plastic and petroleum, it's overlooked, and the oil and gas industry sees it as like their savior for their product. And so, not surprisingly, as we ramp down coal and ramp down using oil and gas for heating our homes and all of those things, plastic is going to be the number one driver of greenhouse gas emissions.
Is there anything with regard to competing advertising that Earth Island and other organizations aligned with environmental stewardship can be putting out there to compete with this marketing based advertising?
Well, I mean, we can continue to try to get the right ears and get in terms of through lawsuits, through other direct action, through bringing people together and get I mean, I think that the campaigns that we've launched, both traditional press and social media, have been getting traction and getting that word out. But it's not. I'm not really like a communications person, so I can't speak so much to like what the most effective venue is.
But probably, would you agree that the amount of money that organizations that are trying to push back on big plastic have for those capacities of advertising, marketing, or just even messaging is far less than the
Oh, yeah.
organizations
I
that
mean, if I remember correctly, Blue Triton spent it's somewhere 20 to 30 million in marketing in 1 year, and that's multiple times our budget. I mean, our whole organization budget, not just our communications budget.
there was another question related to some of the lawsuits that you noted in your presentation. Is there anything that we could do on a local level that would basically reinforce the lawsuits that are happening on the larger level. So is there something that we could do legally? Is there any legal action that we could take in our local communities outside of our ban activities? I should say, but I would
Well,
imagine.
yeah, I mean, I think the more fronts in terms of bringing complaints to, you know, whether it's your state AG about false advertising or bringing consumers together to file, on a class action or even just an inquiry to, whether it's the Trade Commission or your like local regulators, the more that we can show that we're paying attention to this issue and concerned about this issue, I think the better.
So we have some sort of standing just to claim that there's false advertising? So these types of products need to be, for example, Coca-Cola on the Cape does have an operation up in Sandwich. It's a town close to our hearts right now, given that there is a town meeting coming up next week related to reestablishing the ban on single-use plastic water bottles. Would some kind of legal action against them make sense? Could we do something like that on a local basis?
I mean, I don't know Massachusetts law, but usually consumers have like standing under their consumer protection laws, individual consumers, and you would want to talk to a, a law firm that specializes that with that there in your area. But every state has these consumer protection laws, so
Thank you. We're going to look into that.
you should.
Thank you very much. So there's a question here that I'm going to go on to. It's insurance companies. And this is a really great question. Insurance companies mitigate risk on the part of
Mm-hmm.
those that they're insuring. Has there been any kind of action with regard to insurance companies or and plastic risks um, in terms of threats or this discontinuation of coverage?
Yeah, there is definitely organizing and advocacy going on to insurance companies by different organizations to make insurance companies aware of the risks that their insured parties face when it comes to plastic. So, the risk, I mean, of litigation, the risk, the market risk around plastic, of the changing regulatory scheme as plastic becomes more of a problem, more governments are going to start of creating regulations that can make using plastic or relying on plastic as part of your product difficult or expensive. And of course, we also have now the United Nations Environment Program has announced that they're going to be working on a global treaty. So all of those things are changing the framework for doing business, and there are organizations that are, you know, bringing this information to insurance companies.
With that in mind, I'm going to switch it just slightly differently. Is there a relationship between the philanthropic or CSR platforms of these companies and their plastic pollution? I mean, do they support organizations that help them obscure or make ambiguous the fact that they're polluting?
Yeah, yes, they do. Um, so I know, like Pepsi, for example, will use its philanthropic arm to create like recycling groups in schools and to promote the concept of recycling and organize like cleanups in order to then recycle the bottles. So they will spend a lot of money through their philanthropic endeavors to support those pieces that create the narrative that recycling is the answer. If only we're putting money into that.
This is a question that relates directly to our activities on the Cape. We are confronting citizens that are arguing the convenience of single-use plastic as well as their recyclability. But as you point out very clearly in the presentation, the recyclability is questionable. It's just a question of the indication that it has the capacity to be. But what about the human health and environmental impacts? Is there anything else that we can talk about there, and how do they frame into the lawsuit as well?
Yeah, so we don't, we in our lawsuit don't go as much into the human health and impacts, but, and as I said earlier in the presentation, there's still a lot that we don't know, but we do know that we are ingesting plastic. It's coming from the plastic packaging that wraps our food and contains our beverages. And we do know that plastic, is a product that contains many problematic chemicals from a human health standpoint. What we don't know yet the full extent of the damage it's doing to our bodies, but there are lots of indications that it's creating, fertility, reproductive issues, disruptions to our endocrine system. So there's a lot already out there. And I would point you to the Food Plastic Packaging Forum. They've done a lot of work, and Pete Myers has done a lot of work on this for more information about like where the current state of play is with respect to plastic and its and the packaging and its impacts on our bodies.
This is another question. If plastic could be banned, is there enough glass, paper, or alternative packaging to support the level of consumption that we've gotten accustomed to?
I believe there is.
Is there a question that we could actually change slightly? Do we need to be accustomed to this level of convenience?
I mean, my personal feelings are that we probably can do with less, but I can't speak for for others.
When we look at the arguments that are being used, if we're not going to necessarily bring up the health and environmental components, what about the fact that these individuals who claim that using plastic is within their freedoms because it's available and it's sold in the store? I would imagine from a legal perspective, especially looking at big tobacco and the constraints that we've placed on tobacco over the years, as well as now the taxation elements, that there are legal channels that we can show that once a person's freedom extends beyond themselves to infringe on someone else's, that it ceases to be their freedom. Is that type of argument even possible when it comes to plastic?
I mean, these are the same kind of arguments that are playing out with guns too. From my perspective, if you want to talk about your freedom, then okay, but you should be paying for all the external costs associated with your choice. And right now, plastic is artificially cheap because we don't account for all the costs of plastic packaging. And so, maybe let's look at it like we do with cigarettes and add some taxes, because the choice to use plastic is going to cost the rest of us in the cleanup.
The other counter that we've recently had is that cigarette butts, since we know that they're also made of plastic, but they are the number one item found on beach cleanups, that should be the primary focus of reduction, not single-use plastic bottles. Would you have any kind of counter to that in terms of your
Yeah.
own experience here?
I mean, first, it's not by weight, it's by number. But second is that cigarette butts are often, they're kind of thrown where they're smoked. So it's more likely that you're going to find a cigarette butt on the beach because people were, walking and they threw the butts there or whatever, or nearby, and it was washed during a storm. But that doesn't mean that there's not a lot of other plastic entering the ocean. It's just not coming up on the beach. So plastic bottles are going to float. They're going to break down and not necessarily look like a bottle. It's going to look like fragments of plastic. We don't know the weight of all of that plastic when you're looking at a beach cleanup. it's very hard to pick up the much smaller fragments. So while that's what you're seeing on the beach, that isn't representative of the of the of the plastic that's actually, entering the environment. It's just that it's because of the way cigarette butts are thrown and the nature of the other types of plastic that you just see cigarette butts more on the beach.
Are there any particular points that you wish people would take away from just the discussion that you've had today? Because you provided us with a little broad discussion on the legal elements as well as the continuing elements with Nestle Waters and Coca-Cola. But any takeaways that we could use in terms of work to assist Earth Island and its initiatives, as well as we're trying to seek to assist our own?
Well, I think again, like the more that we can get this information out there, the better. I think when people start to realize that these are the same tactics that are used over and over again, to me, it becomes like extra horrifying because it feels very, it feels very coordinated and very duplicitous and intentional, like that, it's a very intentional plan to make us feel responsible, even though these corporations are making so much money off of, in the case of plastic, off of artificially cheap oil and gas, and the choice to use this very cheap and very, very harmful product. So I think the more that we can make these connections clear, both specific to plastic, but also to the way that the same type of campaign has been used in other contexts, the more people will see it as a real problem and issue.
I think to close our conversation, which I thank you very much for, is what is the most important thing for us to do?
Vote, probably. Support legislation that support support represent representatives at all levels that are going to push for changes in laws with respect to plastic and oil and gas, and and get out there and get other people on board to support these efforts, because we're really, we need at this point really large scale policies to address these problems.
Thank you so much, Sumona. I really appreciate your time this evening. You're out in California and you've made the time to speak with us out here in Massachusetts. And we really do need some of this information to help us in the next week. For those of you who may not be from Massachusetts, we have been successful at promoting a plastic bottle ban across the 15 towns that comprise Cape Cod. And we have a little pushback that we're still working on. But Massachusetts is the first state that ever had a single-use plastic water bottle ban, and that was in Concord, Mass. And that is the example that we have built our movement on here. So thank you so very much. Thank you so much for supporting us here through your time and speaking to us through the podcast and now this. So I appreciate it a lot.
You're welcome. It was nice to be here.
Thank you.